A Written Testimony isn't an album I'd say I've been anticipating, considering how long ago I heard Star Wars EP and, Act 1 and Exhibit C, a song that in hindsight almost sounds like a summarized version of A Written Testimony. The idea being somewhat similar in describing this somewhat underdog story rising to his position, rising to his prophecy almost. I'm still waiting on Act 2, Patents of Nobility, but and all these things considered reminds me of a time where Just Blaze had announced that Jay Electronica had an album that was on the way. I was so enamored by this news at the time, I almost took the liberty of going through most of Just Blaze's production history just to find a Lucy of Jay Electronica anything 10 years ago. I happened upon the song with Eminem and Lil Wayne, No Love, for instance, and upon hearing it, I was like, well, if Just Blaze has time to produce this trash, he should have time to produce for Jay Elec. I was wrong. While on this search, it was also announced that Jay Elec had signed with Roc Nation. Like, now it's definitely gotta be coming by early 2011. Nothing. But I'm willing to forgive all that because A Written Testimony is here today in 2020, the third month of the new decade, and let's talk about it. The overwhelming event. The intro track off the album takes a speech from Louis Farrakhan that talks about black people being the true children of Israel. And I think there's a relation Jay makes to himself as a rapper, as Farrakhan speaks on the purpose of a lawyer to prove his case and let the jury pretty much decide. And Jay, throughout his more than 10-year solo absence, has been thrown into the greatest of all time conversation many times without the catalog to back up such claims. The track almost begins to give off this, well, you asked for it kind of vibe, so here it is. As the pianos and the organs build up into this almost birth of an anointed or chosen child, that eventually levels out into a time skip where we see present day Jay Electronica. And the intro track acts as such an important center stage for this album because Jay Electronica is, at least in rap music, one of the least accessible rappers connected to one of the most accessible rappers in hip-hop. His existence in music after 2009 seemed almost mythical, with features that never really stood on their own 2 feet and almost timid solo drops. The lore behind Jay Electronica grew to a point where he came off like a character in the Quran, someone you'd read about who had enough historical significance to be written about, but not enough to be observed beyond the highest point of their relevance, which for Jay Electronica was without a doubt 2008 to 2009. The respect that Jay has for Hove is clearly illustrated in his first few lines on the track Ghost of Soulja Slim, R.I.P., as he tells the audience to consider whatever comes from he and Hove to be Quran and from anyone else, harem. And in Christian terms, hearing the word through Jesus from God is the same as hearing it from he himself. In Islamic terms, though he's thought of as more of a prophet or a messenger, the word is still true. Making sure to call Jay-Z Hove in this instance is wordplay on such another level. To acknowledge Hove as a god and yourself almost as his messenger in rap, or they're essentially one and the same, is crazy. Can we talk about Hove's verse? He actually responds to the criticism that he got during his NFL deal. So Farrakhan talking to basically house niggas defending their slave masters leads perfectly into I could never sell my soul, they sold their soul to me, speaking on the necessity for destruction within a community to dominate it, the same way your oppressors infiltrated inner cities with unfair laws and drugs. However, you're unlikely to see the fruits of that labor in the same lifetime it began. So put a pin in it and we'll come back to it after I finish. This track is really a true gem and is beautifully produced by Jay Electronica himself, that interpolates something that sounds straight out of a 70s French film with all these accordions. Hove is in form so rare on this album, he'd make the sentence, oh, rappers can still be great in their 50s, believable. Hove still sounds almost unreachable, and I'll get into that a little bit later. I think Hove realizes the significance of this moment, and in a way co-signing it with a great pen, not just because it's his artist, but because he knows Jay Electronica's potential. Imagine the current drive of a Jay Electronica in his 40s reminding Hove of a 30-something-year-old version of himself as he feels he's about to crown one of the greatest MCs to ever do it. That would give any MC clear motivation to rap their ass off. But Jay-Z's delivery and level of energy during this tracks is a feeling I wish I equally felt from Jay Electronica. There are times where it seems based off writing and vocal expression, Hove is more excited and passionate about a written testimony than Jay Elec himself. I mean, I genuinely would understand if Hove's verses were getting worse. He's 50, He's a billionaire. You'd expect him to be so far removed from the culture that he can no longer be inspired by it. That ain't it, Chief. Jay and Hove go back and forth on The Blinding, referencing themselves, families, possessions, and accomplishments as a divine allegory finally fulfilling its foretellings. I'm not a fan of the intro instrumental, this distorted bass and these Middle Eastern yelping samples, and I haven't a clue if they're stretching out the sound of a hi-hat and a snare, but it sounds like fish hitting the oil on a skillet. The transition where Travis Scott gets possessed by Heartless era Kanye West with softer drums and a much needed continual synth is a very welcome change. And during the remainder of this verse, Jay Electronica goes over his conflicts with fulfilling obligations and being inspired to do so, almost as if he's asking if his daughter outweighs his insecurities. And Jay doesn't appear on this album concerned with explaining his absence. He does, however, seem much more interested in explaining his stimulus, what gets and keeps him going. It is refreshing to see a rapper so unconcerned with the requests of the public he doesn't even feel the need to address them in his music. These songs and these topics seem to push him farther and farther away from modern society and the spotlight, while the buzz from this record will undoubtedly drag him back in. And there seems to be an obvious reluctance to that in light of the religious foundation written testimony has. Though he seems indecisive at the idea of being clung to by the public, he remains in the know as he speaks about the Flint water crisis and ICE tearing families apart at the border on Fruits of the Spirit. One of my favorite lines off this record and that he's ever spit. The prayers of the slaves are the wings that carry us. A field full of dreams is where they tried to bury us. Oh my God, that is beautiful. And a similar back and forth is explained in Shiny Suit Theory. Now I know this single came out over a decade ago, where Jay emphasizes the importance of living in accordance to the spirit as opposed to the world. The Grammys, money, recognition, the culture that Diddy emphasizes to Jay don't motivate him, as his goals and values are explained as far beyond what the eye can see. This almost awareness of one's own significance and worth seems admirable and confident from the perspective of Jay, but threatening from the perspective of America. And Hove then questions his shrink, how on earth he'd explain his life up until that point. Someone gone from warring to Warren, from undercover to covers, a rapper slash hustler in the same country that used to own us as slaves, the same country that used to make black women sit at the back of buses, the same country that used to make us drink from separate water fountains, the same country that made us attend separate schools. In this America, you believe that there's a guy that exists like that and he's black? You must be crazy. Let me give you these pills, man. The triumphant truth behind this track is that it's prophetic. Released almost a decade ago, Hove's verse has aged beautifully. It reads like a walk out of your therapist's office and a return to say, I told you so. As Jay-Z is still alive and well and prospering, Jay Electronica remained in accordance to his own way of life and still attracted the eyes of almost everyone who would have jumped at the chance to hear him a decade ago. And if remaining true to your goals and living consistently, regardless of promises of any enticing possessions flashing your vision, or whatever doubts may pass through your ears as you navigate through a country that has historically been against you, is the definition of being a black king, then this track, with its release date being almost a decade ago, acts as that idea's foretelling and its fruition at the same time. Shiny Suit Theory literally foretold the continued success of a Jay Electronica and a Jay-Z, and realized it. And that's how a good portion of this album works, like a prophecy. Jay-Z delivers yet again another great verse about how he doesn't want folks' narcissism to cloud the moment of his death. How if anyone is to mourn him publicly, it should be those closest to him. Unfortunately, though, some of this, or a lot of it, is overshadowed by there being entirely too much going on in the Flux Capacitor instrumental. But the one bar that doesn't get overshadowed one bit is the "You backstabber is gonna turn me back to the OJ." Oh my God, if you understood how great that line is, like the triple entendre. Ezekiel's Will might be the best example of a complete Jay Electronica song, where Jay-Z and The Dream act as support roles instead of main ones. The Dream is also used beautifully on this album. He comes off like an old female soul singer. On Ezekiel's Will, Jay's flow is so loose and charismatic. His energy is so confident and seasoned. Vocal inflections reminiscent of someone overlooking what they just said and honestly being impressed with themselves. Like, chuckling in disbelief at what they're doing and how effortlessly it's coming to them. The same thing goes for All Praises Due to Allah, where Hove, in a supportive role to Jay's verse, gives a heartbroken refrain about lost loved ones and his desperation to maintain his connection to them. So he never deletes the screenshots of their text messages, he never deletes their phone numbers, and this unrealistic hold to withered flesh keeps you from sleeping. Your emotions inhibit your logic as you now require technology to maintain a connection to the spiritual. Meanwhile, Jay Electronica gives a tribute to his mother that is so sad, where he beautifully references the importance of remembering his love for her and refilling up on that love, almost like the importance of mourning. And this track is so gold. It's so gold and spacious and isolated, like standing at the beach at 5 p.m. watching the tide come in. The guitar is ironically so full of life and color, while the sentiments expressed are filled with such gloom and sorrow. While the song is so sad, it reminds you to keep going simultaneously. It's a constant look or perspective or analyzation of the beauty that life offers, how it can give you love and how it can give you pain at the same time, and it doesn't shift its focus or its gears. It maintains that energy the entire song. And that's the part of this album that I love so much, because I believe that A Written Testimony is just shy from being a great album. I do. I believe A Written Testimony is a good album with great moments. And unfortunately, many of those great moments come from Jay-Z himself, who, if you listen to next to Jay Electronica, you notice a pretty decent gap. The gap isn't as wide in their lyricism as much as it is in their content. Fact of the matter is, I know just as much about Jay Electronica now as I did 10 years ago, which is basically nothing. It walks a similar tightrope that Jesus is King did, albeit without the corny Chick-fil-A lines and giving your actions divine justification through religious explanation. A Written Testimony shrouds Jay Electronica with biblical references and practices that honestly prevent listeners from connecting with him, as opposed to Jay-Z, who offers himself, yes, as a hustler turned mainstream billionaire rapper, businessman, but also as a regular human being, a human being with their own motivations and thought process developed in getting to that point. I feel like this album taught me more about what Jay Electronica isn't as opposed to what he is, telling me what he isn't going to do as opposed to what he is going to do. Regardless of how big a role it may play in one's life, you are not your religion. You are your own person, and while enlightenment, composure, consistency, and faith are all beautiful, admirable things, they don't make for a decent underdog story. Not that you need to have one, but shouldn't this album have something interesting either in character or in concept for the listener to attach themselves to? Besides Jay-Z, even the Quran unravels and expounds on the challenges facing the characters within it. And before someone says it, no, I'm not talking about him having writer's block. No, I'm not talking about him not being motivated to release an album he promised to release. I would just prefer the last 10 years, not the last 40 days. And I don't think Allah would have a problem with that. And I know before I said there was a noticeable gap between Jay Electronica and Jay-Z, but honestly, there's a noticeable gap in the writing on A Written Testimony and even the writing on Exhibit C. And speaking of Exhibit C, where on earth is Just Blaze? This man gave you the foundation for arguably your best written song, and he doesn't show up on your debut album, but Hove is holding your hand like it's your first day of kindergarten? Man, make it make sense. In his defense, Jay Electronica never said what type of album this would be. He never said it was going to be a solo venture. He just promised an album. He didn't say what it'd sound like. He didn't say who it'd be with. He didn't say who it'd be produced by. I love Alchemist on this as well. You need more Alchemist production. You need more No ID production, because honestly, a lot of the beats on this record, it gets in the way of their voices sometimes. Is this album high in thought? Yes. Is this album original? Pretty much. Does this album feature some pretty good writing from Jay Electronica? It does. Is this album good? Without a doubt. But does it leave me wanting just as much as I did 10 years ago? 100%. I don't want my slight critiques of this album to prevent people from enjoying it or making people believe that I didn't enjoy it, because I do have things that keep it from being great. But I'm just a little fearful that the moment it created will be bigger and more important than the album itself. In 10 years, I'll probably be asked, hey, you remember when Jay Electronica released his album? And I'm likely to respond with, yeah, but do you remember him on his album? Still, I'm not going as far as to call this some type of Watch the Throne 2. I think that's really ridiculous. But there is a lot of Jay-Z hand-holding, and in that he steals the spotlight more often than you think. Jay Electronica on A Written Testimony is one of the most talented MCs I think I've ever heard, but one of the most talented MCs that doesn't have much to write about. Jay Electronica with A Written Testimony featuring Jay-Z. Thank y'all for watching. That's how I felt about this album. Still really enjoyed it. And that's all I got, man. Y'all let me know how you felt about it in the comment section down below. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it. And I'll see you next time. I'm out. Peace.